The family of Harry Dunn has urged the government to refuse the extradition of Julian Assange until the U.S. returns the suspect in his death back to the UK.
Dunn family spokesman Rad Saiger accused the U.S. of hypocrisy in seeking Assange's extradition, despite rejecting the return of Anne Sakulas.
She is suspected of causing the teenager's death by dangerous driving.
The family said the Foreign Secretary told them he is reviewing all options.
The 19-year-old's parents have called on Dominic Raab and the government to refuse any further extradition requests by the U.S., including that of the WikiLeaks co-founder, after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo rejected extraditing Sakulas last month.
Ms. Sakulas, a U.S. national and the wife of an intelligence officer, claimed diplomatic immunity after the fatal crash in August, and returned to the U.S.
Mr. Saiger said the Foreign Affairs Committee had accepted their request for a public inquiry into the extradition, and the diplomatic immunity given to Ms. Sakulas, who reportedly worked for the CIA.
It comes after the Foreign Office said it had no plans to launch a public inquiry into the teenager's death, saying it was confident the case had been handled properly and lawfully throughout.
Mr. Dunn died after his motorbike was in collision with a car owned by Mrs. Sakulas.
The crash happened outside RAF Croughton where Mrs. Sakulas' husband Jonathan worked as an intelligence officer.
Mr. Dunn's mother, Charlotte Charles, and father, Tim Dunn, said Mr. Raab told them in a January 27 meeting that the government is reviewing all options after the U.S. refused to return Ms. Sakulas to the UK.
Referring to Mr. Assange's potential extradition to the U.S., Mr. Saiger said Mr. Dunn's family understand and respect the huge public interest attached to extradition, adding that no one must be allowed to evade justice by fleeing a country.
In refusing the UK's lawful extradition request, Mr. Saiger accused the US of launching the single greatest attack on its so-called special relationship with the UK.
Mr. Saiger added, the US is not behaving like an ally and has effectively thumbed its nose up at the UK and ignored the clearly laid out provisions in the treaty, effectively tearing it up.
He said the principle of reciprocity is at the heart of any extradition treaty, which the U.S. is failing to abide by in its disgraceful refusal to extradite Ms. Sakulas.
In doing so, they are demonstrating an extraordinary amount of hypocrisy, and the double standards on display are unprecedented, he added.
Mr. Saiger continued, on behalf of Harry Dunn's family and the millions of concerned citizens in the UK, I now demand that the UK authorities block any further extraditions to the US, including the one of Julian Assange, until such time as Anne Sakulas is extradited and back on UK soil facing the justice system here.
Mr. Pompeo previously raised the prospect of a deal to be done over Mr. Dunn's case and the US investigation of Prince Andrew's Jeffrey Epstein connections.
But Mr. Raab said there would be no haggling over the two cases, saying the extradition treaty with the U.S. is rules-based.
Mr. Saiger said Mr. Dunn's family had been badly let down since his death and urged the government to show us what they are made of, if they are to instill any confidence that they really do have our backs.
His comments followed Saturday's protest in which hundreds of Assange's supporters marched through London ahead of the start of his extradition trial at Woolwich Crown Court on Monday.
Mr. Assange is facing extradition to the U.S. on 18 charges and faces up to 175 years in prison if found guilty.